MSD podcast, Q&A, Todd Group HQ senior member question in regards to providing listeners with background information and lineage. Starting at a young age at the Baldock Institute and having been involved at my entire working life, this would take a considerable amount of time to compile. So with limited time prior to leaving for overseas to conduct the last course for the year, I've decided to start with information about my entry to the Baldock Institute and time there up until when I took over on Harry's retirement. I visited the Baldock Institute for the first time in the early 1970s after school and asked Harry if he would instruct me in military unarmed combat and military self-defence. His answer was no. He went on to say that military unarmed combat after World War II was too violent for civilian use. He asked me how I knew about military unarmed combat and what was my interest in it. I told him I'd seen on TV a small video clip of elite forces doing hand-to-hand combat, and what I'd seen made sense to me. I told him I'd faced many much older, bigger bullies because of my physical size, and the only thing I knew to do was fight dirty. He asked me what I meant by fighting dirty, and I told him kicking them in the shins, heel stomping on their foot, or poking them in the eyes. He seemed surprised, but offered for me to train there in physical culture, wrestling, boxing, and jiu-jitsu. My thinking was I would train in everything he had to offer in the hope that one day he would show me his military self-defense and unarmed combat. One thing I possessed was physical strength, and I got plenty of chance to lift heavy weights over the years at the Baldock Institute. I entered the Baldock Institute at a time when Harry was downscaling. There had been a lot of big gyms open up, and he did not have the wrestling teams of years gone by. This provided a lot of time for me to spend with Harry at the Baldock Institute. The physical culture started out with physical fitness, strength and conditioning training. Lots and lots of lunges, squat thrusts, power cleans, weightlifting, and every other physical exercise you could imagine. He told me I was strong for my age, and I told him that back in the early 60s, my father had put me in a physical culture competition at the Carisbrook rugby ground, and that I'd won it and was too afraid to go up and get my prize. I was only about 2.5 years of age. I showed Harry the photograph from the newspaper article, and he remembered it as he was there officiating. In the mid-70s, I started working as a bouncer, initially on the doors at teenage discos and later at pubs and clubs. This was in the days where doorman or the doorman industry was not really regulated, and it could be a bit like the Wild West. I chose to work at some of the roughest pubs and clubs where most bouncers didn't want to work. Cuts, scrapes and bruises come with the territory, and I remember going to train at Harry's one day there with a fat lip and a black eye, and this was really the turning point, and this is when Harry agreed to teach me unarmed combat and self-defense. Initially, it was his World War II basic unarmed combat and basic military self-defense package that I learned. Ground combat and takedowns for the battlefield, all very different to the jiu-jitsu type groundwork and takedowns he had shown me. Stamp kicks and heel stomps, palm heel strikes, edge of the hand strikes, how to clinch, and so on. It was not only the skills themselves, but how they come with a complete strategy and all the how-to and what to do if things go wrong, like contingency options. Individual one-on-one training with Harry meant that there was a lot of attention to detail, and I would not move on from one skill to another until I had mastered the previous skill. The physical culture and combat sports and jiu-jitsu training continued. On the door, there were instances where I had to disarm weapons or intervene when punters were using or threatening to use weapons, and Harry decided it was time to teach me his armed combat training package. This was completely different from the self-defense training that Harry provided at the Baldock Institute, as it was not only disarming capabilities but also offensive actions before the street weapons or military type disarming and weapon usage began. I had to learn Harry's sword fighting program. This started executing the skills from a seated position, then from a standing position, and then on the move. Next up came improvised weapons or military issue type non-ballistic weapons. I learnt disarming of edge dagger type weapons and bludgeon type weapons, and also how to use them offensively and counter-offensively. This was followed by his bayonet training course, and then the disarming of pistols and long rifles. There was training in the use of the entrenching tool and old wooden army tent poles. Always combined was combat conditioning and battle fitness type training. This included a lot of the holding ground, maintaining stability of Greco-Roman freestyle wrestling, catch wrestling, pankration type basics that Harry explained to me had come from ancient European battlefield warfare. When the time was right, I'd spoken to Harry about wanting to become a military unarmed combat and self-defense instructor. Harry told me there was no slot or cell in the military in New Zealand, but he was prepared to instruct me in practices and principles of not only skills development, but also skills delivery and conducting of courses. I started to receive interest from doormen and other people I met through working on the door in regards to learning unarmed combat and military self-defense. And I asked Harry if I could conduct training at the Baldock Institute, and unfortunately, through a stamp kick, 2 floorboards had recently been broken, and he said he didn't want any of that type of training going on there. Possibly because he did not want other members to see this type of training, as many had asked him about it and he had never consented to training them in it. I asked Harry if he had any objection to me conducting training outside of the Baldock Institute, and he said he did not. So, in the mid-1970s, I established a satellite training facility in a building in Princess Street in Dunedin. There was considerable interest from the outset, and before long we had to move around into Stafford Street into a bigger premises, and had multiple moves after this time until a long-term member of the Baldock Institute that had been training from me in unarmed combat and self-defense, Graham Reid, suggested to Harry it would be good to have the unarmed combat and self-defense training conducted out of the Baldock Institute. Harry agreed, and we made our final move back to the Baldock Institute. This was the early 1980s, and it was at a time when Harry was looking to retire. Harry and I discussed this, and it was decided that I would take over the Baldock Institute on his retirement. Harry had hoped I would continue with all the teachings of the Baldock Institute, but I respectfully told Harry that I wanted to focus mainly on the unarmed combat and self-defense, with some of the strength and conditioning. For the next 3 years, I worked with Harry on learning how the Baldock Institute operated, and also learning some new skills, as in massage therapy and manipulation and recovery type skills, along with other aspects of physical culture and combat sports. While Harry was not completely happy with my primary training provision being military unarmed combat and military self-defense, he did understand that this was my passion and this was what my strengths were in, and he fully supported me. The 3 years of the preparing to take over the Baldock Institute went very fast. After I purchased the Baldock Institute equipment and intellectual property, Harry stayed on for the next 3 years, and this was a very special time for me when I learned a lot about the background of the Baldock Institute and his depth of knowledge, as well as the lineage and where the training had come from. It was during this period that Harry told me more about other allied expert military instructors from the Great Wars, and advised me on how I should pursue my career as a military, close combat and self-defense instructor. In upcoming podcast editions, I will go into Harry's complete background and then my advances and continuation in the instructing of military close combat and military self-defence.